Good afternoon, everyone. Access Financial is hosting a webinar on permanent placement and contracting in Switzerland. The webinar will cover the critical aspects of working with contractors or permanent placements in Switzerland. Laura and Victoria from RSM in Lausanne will be the speakers with me. RSM International, or what's RSM now, is a multinational network of accounting firms. They're the world's sixth largest accountancy professional services network by revenue. Their range of services include assurance, tax advisory, management consultancy, financial advisory, and risk advisory. Access Financial, I hope most of you will know, we're an international contract management business. We're headquartered in Switzerland, and we're present in 9 locations around the world. The first topic I'm going to cover briefly is just to give you some idea of the Swiss economy. The Swiss economy, Switzerland has got one of the highest GDPs per head in the world at about 80. I mean, the last figures I've got were $85,000 per head. The main industries are machinery, chemicals, or watches, which we all know about, textiles, and precision instruments. As I said, the average gross salary is 89,000. This was in last year, 2022. The economy is principally it's the services sector. 3/4 of the economy is based in services. The agricultural sector is very small and only contributes about 1% to GDP. Around 2/3 of Swiss imports are from the EU, and 43% of Swiss exports are to EU countries, and the other trading partners are principally the major one is China and the US. The main industries are machinery and chemicals, watches, textiles, precision instruments, insurance, and pharmaceuticals. We've got in Switzerland the VAT rate is the lowest in Europe at 8.1%. Remarkably, the unemployment rate stands at only 2%. So Switzerland, we have to understand, is not in the EU. But it has signed up for many of the protocols within the EU, including the free movement of persons. The major companies, I mean, Switzerland has got a home and the European seat of many large companies. I mean, some of the biggest by turnover are Glencore and Vitol, Trafigura, Cargill, Mercuria, Nestlé, Adecco, Roche, Gunvor, Novartis, BHP, ABP, Holcim, Mediterranean Shipping, and UBS. So you can see for its size, it really does punch hugely above its weight. So the general view is that despite the instability generally, the Swiss economy is likely to do very well. To do very well, it needs skilled personnel, despite the fact that the Swiss workforce is extremely well educated and highly skilled. But there is a shortage of most skills for the industry, and this sort of signals that there's going to be continued need for both permanent placements and contract workers to sustain that economy. So with a bit of background of the size and the importance of the Swiss economy, let's move on to Swiss immigration. So there are some interesting factors in Swiss immigration. If we look at the growth of the Swiss population over the last 10 or so years, you can see it's grown from, well, less than 10% over 3 years. So this is steady increases, but it's not dramatic. I mean, it's nothing like the UK, where the population growth was almost 10% last year. So this has been obviously controlled immigration. Now, some of the factors that have led to this controlled immigration is a quota system. There is a quota system in Switzerland for nationals who are non-EU. EU nationals have got free access to the Swiss market, with the exception from 2023 of Croatian nationals who are now subject to a quota. They were initially when they joined the EU, that was lifted, and now the Swiss government has decided to reimpose that. The labour market needs, as I just alluded to before, is such that the the real drive for immigration is that you almost certainly need to have a job before you can come into Switzerland and be granted a work permit. So it's very much employment driven. There is family reunification, as in most countries. Switzerland has been generous, I would say, regarding political asylum, but it's also been relatively good at integrating people who've come into the country. And I think you've got to acknowledge that Switzerland has one of the highest percentages of non-indigenous population within the OECD. So nearly around 25% of the population are not people who were born in Switzerland. A very high percentage indeed. So what can we say about the number of immigrants? So we've got about 2.2 immigrants, foreigners, people not of Swiss nationality living in Switzerland. Now the top countries they come from are Italy, obviously, Germany, Portugal, France, and Spain. Now you can see there are various grades, various kinds of work permits that are issued to foreign nationals. So the first one is a permit B. This is given to people who have got jobs that are normally of continuing nature, and they would also be for initial residence. If your intention is to stay in Switzerland and work towards permanent residence, you typically start with a permit B. A permit C is permanent residence. Now this is granted to people, EU nationals who have been in Switzerland for 5 years, or non-EU nationals who have been in Switzerland for 10 years. Then there's the permit L, which is given to people who are coming to Switzerland on a short-term contract, with probably no real intention to stay beyond that. Then there's the permit G, which is for cross-border people, so people who live in the surrounding EU countries, whether they are EU nationals or not EU nationals, will get a permit G. That's if they go back home either daily or weekly. Now there are other permits for asylum seekers and diplomats and so on, but they're not likely to affect the audience listening to this session today. So in essence, the employers are responsible for applying for work permits for their employees. It's almost impossible, very, very difficult to apply for a residence permit on your own. There are possibilities if you are setting up a business and you can present a credible business plan, then you may get one on your own, but the vast majority of work permits are actually applied for by the employer. As I said, there are quotas, so there is a limited number of work permits given for nationals who are not EU nationals. In the course of the year, those quotas are reached, then no more work permits are going to be issued. And the processing time, well, it varies. And it's very difficult to say in advance. The only advice that I can give is to apply as early as you possibly can, should you want a work permit for the country. Now, as I mentioned before, that in 1999, Switzerland signed a protocol for the free movement of persons. So EU nationals can freely go and live and work in Switzerland, but they will have to register and they will need work permits, but they're not subject to quotas. So anyone from anywhere else, they're subject to restrictions, and priority is going to be given to people who are already in the country. So if you've already got a permit D and you want an extension and you're part of the quota, then well, fairly, you will get that ahead of someone who is coming to Switzerland for the first time. So just to repeat again, the only exception for EU nationals are Croatians. You may have thought the Croatians can come in unlimited numbers, but that is not true from 2023. As I said, the Swiss government has now imposed restrictions on the numbers of Croatians who can come to live and work in Switzerland. If you want to stay, then there is the expectation that you make an attempt to integrate. My own personal experience is when I first lived in Switzerland, I was invited to the commune, and a hair-raising, I was asked to address the senior people in the village, in French. It wasn't terribly easy, but this kind of integration is expected, and you're supposed to learn French, and this is particularly a condition if you're non-EU and you want a work permit. So I think that probably wraps up a brief introduction into Swiss immigration. Now, I'm going to go in more or less in sequence through the articles of the law that are relevant. It isn't a very long law. It won't take very long, but at least you'll see the structure of the law. Now, the first thing to understand is what is the purpose of the law. So there are three purposes of the law, and the first one is to govern the placement of personnel and the rental of services, and the second is to ensure there's an employment service that helps to create and maintain a balanced labour market, and the third one is to protect workers who are working, coming to Switzerland principally and working. So what there is not a restriction on people who are coming from abroad in this sense, and there's certainly not a specific restriction on labour leasing, which is what you'll find in many other countries. But what there definitely is there is a resistance to social dumping, and social dumping is where employers will bring in foreigners to work in the Swiss market, paying salaries lower than the Swiss averages. So while this is not expressed here in the law, these are the two underlying underpinnings of the law. Now, this law, so what does it cover? Well, if you want to carry on a business, placing the first piece is permanent placements, you can't just do this willy-nilly. There are regulations for carrying on permanent placement business in Switzerland. So you have got to have an authorization in order to do this, and this applies to people even those who are coming for artistic performances. That's also regulated. So if you want to carry on permanent placement in Switzerland, then there are several conditions you've got to fulfill. Firstly, the company that does it has got to be registered on the Swiss commercial register. Secondly, it's got to have suitable commercial premises, and it mustn't carry out any other activities that could damage the interests of job seekers or employers. Once you make an application, that application continues indefinitely, and you have the right of business to carry out that business throughout Switzerland. The authorization carries out business activities limited to certain countries, so it's not everywhere. And the person for the responsible people in the organization, they are mentioned in the authorization. And there are fees for these authorizations, and this will be set by the Swiss government. If you carry out permanent placements, that applies to labour leasing, as we'll see in a moment, if you're required to provide information to the state, then you have to provide it on request. So the fees and charges, well, the government is really making sure that people are not charged overly and unreasonably for the services of placement. So you can see here the placement agent, you may ask a job seeker to pay a registration fee or a placement commission, but it is restricted, and it's only due by the job seeker from the time that a placement has got or on the conclusion of a contract. So there's no way of making money out of offering to find people jobs and then failing to do so. With the foreign placement, the placement commission is only due when the worker gets the authorization, so that if they need a work permit, then you can't charge them anything until they've got that work permit, because without that work permit, they're not entitled to work. Again, the government will set the level of fees and placement commissions that can be charged. Now we turn to labour leasing. If anyone doesn't know, labour leasing is really a sort of tripartite arrangement between a client who wants to use the services of a person who wants to work, and the third element is the company that will act as the legal employer of these people. So the legal employer is responsible for paying these people, but they do not work under the control of that organisation. They work under the control of the end client. Now, there is authorization needed again. You need a cantonal authorization from the canton in which you operate if you want to carry out labour leasing in your canton. But if you want to carry out labour leasing throughout Switzerland, then you need to apply to the State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, that's SECO in Bern, for their authorization as well. So you first apply for the cantonal authorization, you then apply for the SECO's license, and then you are able to carry out labour leasing throughout Switzerland. If you don't, if you have your headquarters in the same canton as the parent company, you have to have separate authorizations. So if you've got branches, for example, you will need separate authorizations for those branches. So what are the conditions for getting a labour leasing license? Well, the first thing, you have to have a company that's registered in the Swiss Commercial Register. So you've got to have premises. You've got to carry out no other duties that are going to interfere with carrying out these duties properly. And the people who are involved, they've got to be of Swiss nationality or have a settlement permit. That means they've got to have a permit C. And they must ensure that the rules of the profession and the law of labour leasing is observed, and they've got to have they've got to have a decent reputation. They have to be involved either in payrolling or recruitment or labour leasing, and to be a fit and proper person to have been given a labour leasing license. Now, the last thing is that next thing is that having got your license, you need to provide financial security that's available to the authorities if the business should fail and there aren't any funds to pay the workers. And the cantons and SECO will set how much this is to be. Normally it's typically about 100,000 Swiss francs. But of course, if your business is very much greater, then that will be that may well be increased. And every branch that you have in Switzerland, then you have to have separate security deposits. Coming on to the employment contracts, much as in any other employment contract, the employment contract terms are set out in the law, and you have to have all the normal terms about where people are working, all the conditions, the pay, and so on. And generally speaking, these contracts will be approved by SECO. They will look at your contracts and see if they're satisfied with them or not, if they pass all these tests. And when clients might ask us to bypass and use someone else's contract, this is impossible. We have to use contracts that have been approved by SECO. And if you did the slide, you can see all the terms later. I shan't go into them in detail. So the things that are that can cancel a contract if you require the worker to hire services to pay emoluments or financial benefits. So you can't do this. You can't make them pay, and nor can you restrict them. So if they want to go and work for another employer, then even if they've got restrictive clauses in a contract you may have from your end client, these are going to be ineffective. If the service doesn't have their authorizations and they enter into this kind of deal, then again, all those contracts are going to be null and void. So now collective labour agreements. Collective labour agreements are agreements typically between the unions and the labour leasing license. The labour leasing license holder has to observe the terms of the collective labour agreements. So you need to find out if there is a collective labour agreement in force in a particular company that you're sending people to. This is particularly the case in almost all blue-collar cases. There will be conditions of minimum standards, minimum salaries, and so on. Although I would point out that in Switzerland, there isn't actually a statutory minimum wage. So the service rental agreements, now these are the agreements that we have with the clients. So we've got to have terms in these agreements, which again meet the LSC, the law of the location service, and have been approved by SECO. And they are fairly straightforward, fairly typical. They're all listed down here, but you can't, for example, you can't just go and use a client's contract and assume that that will be acceptable. It won't be acceptable. The client has got to accept that the contract between them and the labour leasing company is a one that's been approved by SECO. Again, if you don't have any licenses, then those contracts will be null and void. So here's a little diagram to show how the labour leasing works. It's typical of labour leasing anywhere. So what I would say is, well, what are the implications of all this for recruitment businesses who want to trade in Switzerland? Well, the first thing is that by implication, rather than expressly set out in the law, Swiss law forbids foreign recruitment businesses to offer their services in Switzerland. So this law's been going on since 1989. It isn't new, and it is only possible. It's interesting because Switzerland is not part of the EU. If it were part of the EU, it wouldn't be able to impose these restrictions. So let's say a foreign recruitment company wants to do a deal in Switzerland. Then they could be subjecting themselves to fines. These fines can range from 5,000 to 100,000 Swiss, and there is even the possibility of imprisonment for involvement in illegal hiring. And the other thing to note, and I've seen many cases, many clients have come to me on this one, and debts that you incur under these breaches won't be enforceable in Swiss courts. So if you are a foreign recruitment company and you place somebody in a Swiss client, and the Swiss clients were unaware or just chose not to follow the rules, and then you press for payment, you may find that so we simply don't want to pay you because they will know that if you were taken to court in Switzerland, you wouldn't win. Now, they may be in trouble as well, but that's another matter. The Swiss authorities, they really are vigilant in enforcing this law. And the federal and cantonal governments, they both have a role to play in this. You see, SECO and Bern, they exercise overall control. But the cantonal authorities take a close interest in ensuring that there are no breaches of the law. They do this through what they call the service de l'emploi, the employment services. So the cantonal system, Switzerland's comprises 26 cantons, ensures there's always a local employment service nearby. You haven't got to go far, and they are easily able to monitor compliance with the law. On top of that, all the Swiss companies are inspected regularly by the VAT authorities, the employment authorities, the SUVA, the insurance people, and the federal tax authorities. And all this means is that the chances of a foreign recruitment company operating undetected in Switzerland really are very low indeed. So if you do want to work in the Swiss market with permanent placement or contracting or employer of record, you must either hold the necessary licenses or you've got to work with a Swiss company that does. We're a Swiss company. We provide outsourcing services to foreign-based recruitment businesses. We've got the canton and we've got the SECO license to operate in Switzerland, and our staff have got lots of years of experience of operating in the Swiss market. So foreign recruitment businesses often prefer to concentrate on their recruitment activities and outsource the back office work to us or people like us, allowing them, they can ramp up their business quickly without investing time, people and money into gaining experience and expertise in the Swiss market. So outsourcing to AF can bring a number of benefits to foreign recruitment businesses. One is reduced costs, because outsourcing can help companies reduce their costs so they don't have to pay for salaries and benefits of staff in-house and training and so on. We can also offer more efficiency because we can help business improve their efficiencies. They can focus on their job just as we can focus on ours. And the quality, we can also help businesses improve the quality because they can access the experience of experienced people who've been doing this sport for 20 odd years. So I'm not sure there's really time to go into all the services that we want, but what I would point out is we do things like payroll, HR, and compliance work and labour leasing and so on. We run back office for foreign recruitment companies, but we're not an auditing practice. We're not an RSM. And if you need advisory, if you need corporate advice, if you really want to set up companies and so on, then you really want to go and speak to our colleagues who are going to be addressing you very, very shortly. So you get reduced costs, we can increase the efficiency, we can improve the quality of your business, we give you some peace of mind, because Swiss law is labyrinthine, as you're about to find out on the tax side. You really best to leave this to people who do it and don't do much else, and you concentrate on your own areas of expertise. So, but if you're a foreign recruitment company and you are considering setting up, or you're already set up and you've just had enough of doing all this work and dealing with all the administration yourselves, then I do suggest you get in contact with. Well, that's all from me. I'm sure you'll be relieved. And I'm going to hand over now to Laura and to Victoria to cover their topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm going to talk about Swiss Social Security. So let's start with some basics. Let's start with some introduction. So like in many other countries, Swiss Social Security schemes exist to insure people against certain social risks. It's made up of mainly 4 areas: the old age survivors and disability insurance, which is also called the third pillar system, which is the Swiss pension system. Then there's the sickness and accident insurance, the unemployment insurance, and family allowances. All of these insurance cover these risks either through financial benefits that you obtain in case you find yourself in one of these situations, or by covering costs in the events of illness or accident. There are different categories of insured individuals, the biggest category of which is, not surprisingly, employees. And these employees have first pillar contributions deducted directly from their salary in equal proportion as their employer. So it's the employer that pays on their behalf. The obligation to contribute ends when the person reaches retirement age. The current retirement age is set to 65 for men and 64 for women, but it will soon be raised to 65 for both sexes. And employees can, of course, continue working after reaching the normal retirement age, and continue to contributing to the first pillar, but they will no longer contribute to the unemployment insurance. And just a little side note, don't worry too much about what these pillars mean. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on them a bit later. Unemployed people, which is either people who are temporarily without a job or people who simply don't work, also have to pay first pillar contributions, except for people whose spouse works and pays at least twice the minimum contribution, which is set at 1,028 francs. The self-employed are also a category that is insured under Swiss law. However, it is a little bit of a particular notion because it's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis for each individual. And it may be a little bit counterintuitive because, as you can see here, there are a few criteria that the cantonal social security authorities will consider when determining if someone is self-employed or not. So someone will really have to present themselves under a company name, assume the economic risk associated with their work, and freely organize their business, but also, very importantly, work for several clients. So if you have, for example, a consultant that has a prolonged contract with the same client, their relationship may be requalified as a de facto employment relationship. However, for those who do qualify as self-employed, they must pay first pillar contributions themselves. However, they are not insured against unemployment, and they do not mandatorily have to insure themselves with a second pillar. However, they can if they so wish. Another category is the so-called ANOBAG employees, which is a little bit of a particular Swiss concept. ANOBAG is a German abbreviation, which translated basically means employee of an employer without the obligation to contribute to Social Security. So one becomes an ANOBAG employee if they are subject to Swiss Social Security, for example, because of their residence in Switzerland, but they are employed by an employer who is not domiciled in Switzerland. So there are 2 types of these ANOBAG employees, and this is because Switzerland has certain coordination agreements with the EU and EFTA countries. So there are the real ANOBAGs whose employers are not located in an EU EFTA state, and these people do not have any contributions to the second pillar that they must make. And there are the EU EFTA ANOBAG employees whose employer is located in an EU or an EFTA state, and they have this obligation. They also have different obligations on a personal level. So real ANOBAGs, that is people whose employer is outside of the EU EFTA, really have to take over all of these responsibilities themselves. They will really have to go out of their way and register with Swiss Social Security authorities and pay the contributions for the employer and for themselves on their own. The employer has no liability in Switzerland. However, EU EFTA ANOBAG employees, by default, the employer remains liable for the payment of these contributions. So by default, without any derogatory agreement, it's the employer that would have to register themselves and pay contributions as if they were in fact a Swiss employer. However, the employer and the employee can conclude a derogatory agreement allowing these duties to be delegated to the employee, in which case the employee can register on the employer's behalf and pay their contributions on their behalf. But the employer remains liable for the employer's part of contributions in Switzerland. And as I mentioned before, they will also have to register with a second pillar. Of course, there are people who happen to be in Switzerland without being insured to Swiss Social Security. So these will be people who are in Switzerland just on holidays, people who are just studying and not working. These will also be people who are in Switzerland working for 3 months, a year or less, or people who are posted to Switzerland by their foreign employer and have a valid certificate of coverage in their possession. Now I'm going to talk about these 3 pillars. So as you can see here, there are some key features of each of these pillars. This is really a very summary overview, but I'm going to talk about each of these pillars separately in more detail. So the first pillar is a state pension plan, which is meant to cover and ensure the basic standard of living in the case of retirement, or in the case of disability, or for survivors in case of death. Generally speaking, it will not make up a very big part of one's pension. The benefits received will depend on the level of income previously obtained and the duration of contributions, considering that a full first pension pillar is granted after 44 years of consecutive contributions. But there is also such a thing as a maximum first pillar pension. So at some point, no matter how much you contribute, you cannot get more than the maximum. And here you can see the contribution rates for the different categories of people to the various first pillar insurances. Then there is the second pillar, which is the occupational insurance. And as I mentioned before, it's mandatory for employees working for Swiss employers, but also for ANOBAG employees working for employers in the EU or EFTA. For self-employed people, it is not mandatory, but they can affiliate themselves if they so wish. This insurance is much more flexible. Unlike the first pillar, it's not just pension that you can receive. You can withdraw it in capital, partially or fully. You can also withdraw it early, for example, before retirement in certain cases. And it also has some interesting tax mechanisms that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail when we talk about the tax treatment of Social Security payments. Then there is the third pillar, which is an entirely private and entirely optional pension provision, which which workers can use to make up for the remainder of their income not covered by the first 2 pillars. There are 2 kinds of third pillar contributions. There's the third pillar A, which is a form of pension provision concluded either with a bank or with an insurance. And each year, the government sets a maximum deductible contribution, which will vary depending on whether you're an employee or a self-employed person. The third pillar, A, just like the second pillar, is a lot more flexible. It can be withdrawn fully in one go, or it can be withdrawn partially or early. It is also subject to preferential treatment in all of Switzerland. On the other hand, the third pillar B is more like a life insurance. So it is a form of pension provision concluded with an insurance company. And unlike third pillar A, individuals may be required to make a minimum contribution. And that is even if they leave Switzerland, depending on the contract. And the third pillar B's tax treatment is less advantageous. There are some advantages only in the cantons of Geneva and Fribourg, as I will mention later. Unemployment insurance is meant to cover the loss of income when someone loses their job. So it covers employees, but it does not cover self-employed workers because they do not pay these contributions. A number of conditions must be met to be entitled to these benefits. Notably, you will have had to contribute for a certain duration before you become unemployed. And to obtain the benefits, people will be subject to monitoring of job search activities. You have to prove that you're looking for a job. Then we have the accident insurance. And this is, as its name implies, meant to cover employees against professional and unprofessional accidents and illnesses. It aims to provide compensation in these events. And generally speaking, premiums for occupational accidents insurance are paid by the employer, and premiums for non-occupational accidents insurance are paid by the employee, but both can be paid by the employer if the parties agree to do it this way. And the self-employed and the unemployed pay these contributions themselves. The health insurance is not part of the schemes I mentioned before. It is really something quite separate in Switzerland. It's mandatory for people living and or working in Switzerland, generally speaking, both for children and for adults. There are a few exceptions, for example, students temporarily staying in Switzerland, cross-border employees who can choose where they wish to be employed, etc., but it will be mandatory for most people in Switzerland. People can freely choose their insurer, and their contributions, their insurance premiums will depend on the insurer they choose, on the coverage level they choose, and also on the place on their place of residence. It can vary actually quite greatly between different cantons and between different insurers. In addition to this, people can have a supplementary health insurance, which is entirely optional, but it can help cover additional risks, for example, dentist costs or glasses or other such things that the basic insurance may not cover. And the last aspect of the Swiss Social Security is the family allowance, which is a benefit that parents are entitled to if they have children. They have the right to obtain this at least up to the child's 16th birthday, but they may continue receiving this until the child reaches 25 years of age if they remain a student. It's important to note that these allowances are not granted by the state automatically. They must be requested via the employer, so people may need to take some steps to actually obtain these. Additionally, it's worth noting that cross-border employees may also be entitled to family allowances despite not living in Switzerland, depending on whether or not their spouse works in their country of residence. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the tax treatment of the various Social Security contributions. So the first pillar contributions, employee contributions that are paid by the employer are considered to be part of the gross salary but are tax deductible in the tax return. And employer contributions are not considered a taxable benefit. For the self-employed and the unemployed, they can also deduct their contributions from their taxable income. The second pillar contributions are similarly to the first pillar. Employee contributions paid by the employer are part of the gross salary but are deductible via the tax return, while employer contributions are not considered to be a taxable benefit. And self-employed people can also deduct their contributions from their taxable income if they choose to be affiliated, because as I mentioned, it is not obligatory. Now I'm going to talk about this mechanism of the second pillar buybacks. So the insurance companies of the second pillar will calculate for someone who arrives to Switzerland later, for example, someone who arrives at age 35 and starts working, they will calculate the potential hypothetical missing contributions by looking at how much they would have contributed if they had started working at the age of 25 and had the same salary. And then these missing contributions can be bought back, which means that you can fill the gap by making voluntary contributions that are fully tax deductible. These are limited to 20% of your gross income for the first 5 years in Switzerland, and later this limit goes away, and you can contribute as much as you want, which can be quite a significant tax saving. You can completely neutralize your income by making a significant second pillar buyback. However, it's worth noting that if a buyback is made 3 years or less before a withdrawal of capital, the tax benefit will be annulled. So just before retirement or in other cases where you might withdraw the capital, you might want to keep that in mind before making a buyback. Now, the third pillar A and B contributions, as I mentioned before, contributions to third pillar A are tax deductible up to the maximum amount that is set by the government each year. For 2023, for employees, it's 7,056 francs. Excess contributions are not deductible and they must be repaid. Accumulated savings in third pillar accounts are not subject to wealth tax and are not reported on the tax return as the same way as the second pillar assets. By the way, they will also not be considered to be part of one's wealth. Contributions to third pillar B only have tax advantages in the cantons of Geneva and Fribourg, which are the only cantons that allow deducting life insurance premiums. And the surrender value, like any other life insurance, will have to be declared as part of one's taxable wealth. So it will be part of your tax return. As I mentioned before, it is possible to withdraw the second pillar or the third pillar A assets early in certain conditions, under certain conditions in certain situations. So they are as follows. For example, if you purchase a property for to be used as your main residence in Switzerland or abroad, if you start working as a self-employed person, or if you leave Switzerland on a permanent basis. However, your destination will have an impact on what you can withdraw, because if you are leaving for an EU EFTA country, you can only withdraw the non-mandatory portion, while if you leave elsewhere, you can withdraw all of your second pillar assets, and the third pillar assets can be withdrawn regardless of your destination. Both of these withdrawals can be fairly interesting from a tax perspective because they are subject to taxation at withdrawal, which means they will not be part of your tax return, but they will be taxed at a preferential rate, so which is set at 1/5 of the normal income tax rate. And that is true for both early and ordinary withdrawals. So whether you withdraw your assets early because you're in one of these situations, or you simply reach retirement age, you can opt for a partial or a full withdrawal in capital and be taxed at this 1/5 rate. And on the other hand, as mentioned before, third pillar B is not subject to taxation on withdrawal. Accident insurance contributions, as I mentioned before, can be paid. The occupational ones are typically paid by the employer, and it is not considered a taxable benefit, while the non-occupational ones are paid by the employee and are tax deductible. And if the employer pays both, both are not taxable. In terms of health insurance, both mandatory and supplementary health insurance premiums are tax deductible, but the deduction limit varies greatly by canton. A lot of cantons are quite stingy in this matter, so you might not be able to deduct as much as you pay. And family allowance is considered as part of your regular income and will be declared as such in the tax return and will be subject to the same tax rate as the rest of your income. Now I will briefly talk about some global social security notions, about some coordination agreements in place between Switzerland and other countries. So as you can see, there is a sort of hierarchy of norms. There's the Swiss national law, which applies in Switzerland, but then there is the agreement Switzerland has with EU and EFTA countries, which is really the core of the Swiss social security coordination. And then as well, Switzerland has some bilateral agreements with some other countries, and with all the other countries, Switzerland has no agreements with, which means that there is no specific additional mechanism that would apply. The EU agreement, which is called the Regulation 883/2004, applies to all of these states, the EU member states and the EFTA member states, as well as Switzerland, and in some cases to the UK for situations that arose before Brexit. And this regulation applies to nationals of these member states. From a Swiss perspective, it does not apply to third country nationals, but it does apply to refugees residing in one of these states, their family members, and their survivors. The general rule is that that employees are subject to the social security regime of the jurisdiction they work in. So this is really the key principle of this regulation. However, there are two main notable exceptions, which is posted employees and people who work in several member states. So we will look at these now. Posted employees remain affiliated to the social security system of their country of origin. They can be both employees and self-employed individuals. The maximum duration is typically 24 months, but it can be extended up to 60 months, which is 5 years. To be eligible for this derogation, the posted employee must first have been affiliated to the social security regime of their country of origin for at least 1 month before posting. The derogation also cannot apply in cases when one posted employee is sent to replace another. When a posting happens, it's very important that an A1 certificate is issued by the authorities of the country of origin, because this certificate will attest that this person is covered in their country of origin and as such has no obligations in the host country. Additionally, the other exception is people who work in several member states. So the principle of unicity states that workers can only be subject to to the regime of one country at a time. And there are two options. So people who are affiliated in the state where the employer has their place of business, which is most people, unless they spend a substantial part of their activity working in their country of residence. So this is notably important for cross-border workers who may be working from their country of residence remotely. And if the person performs a substantial part of their activity in the state of residence, this has historically been defined as 25% of working time and or remuneration. With COVID, there have been some flexible arrangements, and in some countries, between some countries now it may be more, but to be cautious, it's best to assume that it's 25%. And in these cases, this person will instead have to be affiliated in the state of residence, which can cause significant extra administrative problems for their employer. Additionally, if an employee works for several employers over several countries, they will also be affiliated in their country of residence, regardless of whether they work in that country. So Switzerland also has bilateral agreements with a number of countries that you can see listed here. These are much more limited in scope and are primarily used to determine the social security affiliation of posted employees, meaning that people posted for example, from Australia to Switzerland can remain affiliated to Australian social security under the bilateral agreement. And then, of course, there are countries that Switzerland has no social security coordination agreements with. And this means that there are no mechanisms preventing affiliation to several systems, and there's no protection against double payment. So the contributions will be due based on national law, and in principle, in each country, proportionally to the time spent and remuneration gained in each. So it can be quite messy.
Thank you, Victoria. So I'm taking over, and I will be talking to you about some Swiss tax, the Swiss tax system for individuals in Switzerland. So as an introduction, some Swiss tax principle. As you may know, Switzerland is divided into 26 cantons, which are themselves divided into municipalities. And the Swiss taxes are levied on these three levels, which is canton, municipality, and the confederation. However, it is only one tax return that is managed by the cantonal tax authorities. And that covers the annual income tax and the wealth tax. The wealth tax is levied only by the canton and the communal level, but the income tax is also levied at confederation level. Married couple must file a joint tax return, which also includes their minor children who live in the same household. And to finish with the basic principle, the tax rates for income tax and wealth tax in Switzerland are progressive, meaning that if you have a very high income, you will have a high tax rate, and the opposite also. So moving on to the individual tax liability. So the tax year is the same as the calendar year. It starts on January 1st and finishes on December 31st. And it is covered by one tax return. If there are changes during the year, it is the situation at the end of the year that will be relevant for the whole year. For example, if you move from one canton to another, or if you marry during the year, if you have a child, or if one of your child becomes an adult. How do you become a Swiss tax resident? You become a Swiss tax resident if you are domiciled in Switzerland, if you are staying in Switzerland for at least 30 days while working, or at least 90 days without working. If you are a Swiss tax resident, you are subject to an unlimited tax liability, which covers your global income and wealth, and only real estate, foreign real estate and foreign corporation are excluded, and other topics might be excluded based on double taxation treaties. Swiss nationals and C permits, and anyone married to the former is usually has an unlimited tax liability, and they must file an annual tax return. And B or L permit usually pay tax at source, and they might have the option or the obligation to file an additional tax return. And we can say that their tax liability is limited. Moving on to the limited tax liability. So individuals who are neither domiciled nor resident in Switzerland might be subject to Swiss taxation based on an economic connection. Their tax liability is called limited. So the limited tax liability starts whenever you get a Swiss sourced income in Switzerland, and it ends when the Swiss source income ends also. It's usually a job, for example. The unlimited tax liability is for Swiss tax residents. So it starts whenever you reach 18 years old, which is a majority in Switzerland, or whenever a foreign national takes up residence in Switzerland. And this unlimited tax liability ends whenever you leave the country for good or upon death. Now a few more details about the income tax. So as mentioned, the income tax is perceived on the federal level and also the cantonal and municipal level. At the federal level, the highest income tax rate reaches 11.5%. And for the cantonal and municipal taxes, well, they each have their own law and their own tax rates. It varies very greatly between your place of residence. And the maximal cantonal and municipal rate can reach up to 31%, which makes up a total of maximum 42% of income tax rate. What is in the taxable income? So the most important topic is usually the salary that you get from your employer. It covers the base salary, bonus, and everything within. If you're self-employed, it is also your annual income. It includes also pension payment. As mentioned by Victoria, the family allowances are included, and any other contribution payment you might receive. Also, income from private investments, such as interest and dividends, and finally, income from real estate. However, in Switzerland, the capital gains are usually tax exempt. There are some deductions from your taxable income. There are professional deductions, such as transportation fees and social security that was covered by Victoria earlier. There are also non-professional expenses, such as mortgage interest, real estate mention, and pension payment. Each canton also has some social deduction. Those depend on the family situation of the taxpayer. And this family situation may also have an impact on the tax rate of the taxpayer. It really depends on the canton. Moving on to the wealth tax, which is the second tax covered by the annual tax return. So the wealth tax rate also vary in each canton from the same system, and they vary between 0.2% and 1%. The taxable wealth includes the bank accounts, the investments, the shares that you might have, cryptocurrencies, gold, cash, and loan. It also covers real estate in Switzerland and other valuable assets such as vehicle and art objects, etc. Private debts and mortgages are deductible from the taxable wealth. And like the income tax system, the family situation gives also some social deduction or reduction of the tax rates depending on the canton you're living in. Now the tax at source, which is the income tax directly received on the salary. Anyone holding a B or L permit and employed by a Swiss employer is subject to the tax at source. It also applies to cross-border worker in certain cantons. This covers all three levels of taxation: cantonal, municipal, and federal, and the tax rates are issued by the canton. These tax rates are a little special because they include some lump sum deductions for social deduction related to the family situation, and professional basic deduction. They are not effective deduction. There are some average included directly in the tax rate. The tax is deducted by the employer directly on the monthly salary. And finally, on the general principle, the Swiss resident who are subject to tax at source and who have income or other taxable wealth in Switzerland must file an additional tax return. And in this situation, the tax at source paid is then considered a tax installment. There are some possibilities to request rectification of the tax at source. So the first one must be requested before March 31st of the following year. And you can change this tax scale or the taxable income. For example, you can correct potential withholding mistakes, and you can also ask for the consideration of the taxpayer spouse actual income, because otherwise the taxpayer spouse income is an average taken into account for the tax rate. You can also exclude days worked outside of Switzerland based on some double taxation treaties. However, with this system, you cannot request the, effective deduction for second pillar contribution or for other professional deduction. There is another system available only to Swiss tax resident, and this is the subsequent taxation through tax return. It can be optional, but once you have filed it 1 year, you have to keep filing it for the subsequent years. However, it is also mandatory for some taxpayer, and it is the case if your annual income is above 120K, if you have a real estate in Switzerland, or if you have other income or wealth that is not subject to tax at source but should be taxed in Switzerland. Those taxpayers remain subject to the tax at source, and the tax at source paid becomes a tax installment. Another system, the deemed resident status, is for cross-border workers who work in Switzerland and are subject to tax at source on their Swiss-sourced income, but of course they wouldn't have to pay any taxes on wealth or on any other income which is not sourced in Switzerland. And they can file a limited ordinary tax return based exclusively on their professional activities, and they can request the effective deduction for social contribution and other professional deduction. This possibility, this deemed resident status, is available if you earn more than 90% of your income in Switzerland and it is taxed at source. However, this 90% of the income also includes the income your spouse might have. So if she's employed in Switzerland and pays tax at source, that's okay. But if she gets an important income outside of Switzerland, that wouldn't work. And finally, the deadline to submit this request is also on March 31st of the following year. That was it about the taxes themselves. Now moving on to a slightly different topic, which is the professional expenses. The professional expenses we are talking about are the expenses paid by an employee in the course of his professional duties. So he pays for something and the company reimburses him for these expenses because they're work-related. And the tax topic important is that this reimbursement is not considered a taxable income. There are two types of compensation, either the effective compensation, which is simply you provide a receipt to your employer and your employer pays you back. But there is also a lump sum representation allowance, which corresponds to the allowance determined in advance by the employer and granted monthly in your salary. And with this system, you don't need to provide invoices for expenses below 50 francs. And the entitlement to this lump sum representation allowance depends on the employee's position in the company. It's usually the top management level, and it depends on your income, of course. Usually, these allowance vary between 6,000 a year and 24,000. However, in Geneva is very generous, therefore it can reach up to 100K a year. A specific request must be made by the employer to the tax authorities in order for this lump sum deduction to be tax-free. And it is recommended to work with tax advisors in obtaining this authorization. Finally, I'm going to say a few words about a special tax deduction. So it is the OEXPA deduction. It is a special Swiss regime that allows for special deduction for expatriates. This regulation was developed for expatriates who work in Switzerland on a temporary basis, maximum 5 years usually, and who in principle maintain contact with a foreign country, and therefore they accrue very high expense, work-related expenses, which they can request some tax deduction. The condition to get this OEXPA deduction is to have an expatriate contract with your employer or a mobility clause in your employer. You might also receive a remuneration linked to this special situation, such as a moving allowance or a housing allowance. And if you keep your property in your country of origin, then you would also have additional expenses. These deductions can be implemented directly in the payroll or only in the tax return. It depends. And what are those deductions? The expenses of moving to and from Switzerland, the expenses of accommodation in Switzerland if the expatriate has retained a permanent resident in his country of origin, but it can also be the expenses of language education for minor children who accompany the taxpayer if the public school in Switzerland do not offer an education in their language. Each canton have different practices for determining eligibility and deductible amount for the OEXPA deduction, and it can be quite difficult for the employer to implement it effectively. Therefore, again, the tax consultants are best placed to help you understand these challenges. That was it for my part. I'm going to let Kevin finish up.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think these are probably the clearest expositions of Swiss law that I've ever heard. So well done to both of you. Really very good. And for everyone who has attended, I hope this was of value to you. If you've got any questions, which obviously we couldn't answer everything, and we weren't actually able to take questions directly, but if you've got any questions for RSN or for us, please get in touch and we'll try to answer you as best we can. So on behalf of our guests here and all of Access Financial, thank you very much for attending, and goodbye.